In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. In this video, we're going to talk about the rise and the fall of Solomon's kingdom. It's really amazing to think that the kingdom of Israel was in its absolute height and glory during the time of Solomon, the king who asked for wisdom and the king who built a temple. And it's interesting because when you get to First Kings chapter 9, it talks about the height of the kingdom. First Kings chapter 10, the height of the kingdom. And then in chapter 11, it talks about the downfall of Solomon. And so we're going to walk through these chapters and explain what happened because it not only tells us something about Solomon, but it's going to tell us something about the history of Israel and help us to understand the prophetic literature. So first and foremost, in chapter 8, Solomon dedicated the temple. He acted as a king priest, presiding during the ceremony, offering sacrifices, blessing the people. It recalls us of how David acted like a king priest in Jerusalem. And it really looks back to Melchizedek, the king priest from Jerusalem, back in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 to 20, who met Abraham. I like to say that they're both following the Melchizedek model. It's never explained in the text, but you see it happening in Jerusalem with David and Solomon. So let's go to chapter 9 and let's just read the first couple verses to get a little bit of the context. The Lord is going to appear to Solomon a second time. And here's what happens. When Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord, that's the temple, and the king's house, that's his house, and all that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time. Now, do you remember the first time? He asked for wisdom. Go back to the videos on chapter 3 and 4, and you'll see that. So the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built and put my name there forever. In other words, God's name is there in the sense that he's going to make himself known in this house. He's going to reveal himself to his people and put my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, there shall not fail you a man upon the throne of Israel. So many scholars will look at these words in First Kings chapter 9, and they will explain that there's a conditional element here. So they will often contrast the divine commitment with the conditional. And they'll go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7 and say, God made a promise to David. You will always have a descendant upon your throne. That's called divine commitment. And so here in First Kings chapter 9, we see this conditional element here. There's a human obligation that is needed to fill out this covenant, to walk in the ways of the Lord. And so scholars will often say there's a little bit of a tension between the two. You have the divine commitment, the promise, which is irrevocable, but then you have the obligations, that you have to live out, the human obligation that's required to walk in the ways of the Lord. And so essentially, the blessings and the benefits that are tied to this covenant will be revoked if you don't live the covenant out. So let's put it all in very simple terminology. God is not going to revoke his promise, but if his people and his king do not keep the covenant, they're going to lose their kingdom, they're going to lose their place in the land, and they're going to be taken away into exile. So let's go to verse 6, and here's what it says in chapter 9. If you turn aside from following me, you and your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, Then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done this to his land and this house, to this land and this house? So, in other words, they're going to go into exile and their temple will be destroyed. Well, you only have to read the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations to see that this is exactly what happened. About 380 years later, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the people were taken into exile. It really was the Exodus in reverse. So let's walk through my notes here. I want to just go through this and kind of explain the theology behind this. So, first and foremost, the Lord appears to Solomon a second time. The first time he appeared to Solomon, Solomon asked for wisdom. Go back to chapters 3 and 4 in First Kings. And now he's saying, Solomon, you got to walk in that wisdom. You've got to use that gift of wisdom. And so this is going to become a theme because Solomon, unfortunately, is not always going to use the wisdom that he has. Many people do the same thing. The Lord gives us gifts to live the faith, and sometimes we don't put those gifts into work, into action in our lives. So after that, the Lord promises them that if the king and if Israel does not keep the covenant, they're going to go into exile and their temple will be destroyed. Now, theologically, the exile is like the Exodus in reverse. So you might be thinking, why the exile? Well, it has a theological value. It's like the Lord is saying the Exodus is going to go in reverse. You're going to be taken out of the land. Your temple's going to be taken away. You're going to become like a proverb and a byword. The people are going to ask, why did this happen? In other words, they're going to probe the reason. Why did this happen? And they're going to come to the conclusion, they rejected the Lord. So when is this going to happen? Well, the northern kingdom is going to fall into apostasy and they're going to go into exile in 722. And the southern kingdom is going to go into exile in 587. And it's all going to start through intermarriage with foreign women, and they're going to import foreign gods. So I'm just going to write down here the north, which was known as Israel. Okay, they're going to go into exile in 722 BC. Really, the entire northern kingdom is going to be destroyed. And then the south is going to go into exile, and that's the kingdom of Judah, right around 587. Some say that it's 586 BC, before Christ. And so the northern kingdom, they go away into exile and they kind of disappear. Scholars will say that many of them came down to the south when they fled. And so you had a mixture of people from the north coming down to the south, but others were just scattered among the nations. And then the southern kingdom, Judah, was destroyed in 587 BC. So you can see all this will happen hundreds of years after Solomon. Solomon, unfortunately, he's going to begin to intermarry, and that's going to start the cycle. The intermarriage will lead to idolatry, the worship of false gods, apostasy, and that apostasy is going to spin out of control. So let's talk about how this happened. First and foremost, in chapters 9 and 10, the author of First Kings wants us to see how good Solomon was. Solomon offered burnt offerings 3 times a year. He presided like a high priest, and he did this during the feast days. So many scholars will say that there's something really eschatological here, that you have these feast days which celebrate the goodness of the Lord. They celebrate that all that the Lord has done to save his people and redeem his people. And here's Solomon presiding as a king priest during these feast days. It reminds us of Melchizedek in Genesis 14 and also David when he brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. So Solomon functioned as a king priest. We can look back to 2 Samuel, chapter 6 when David acted as a king priest and he brought the ark to Jerusalem. And then we can look back to 2 Samuel 24 when David offered sacrifices on the same place where the temple would be built to stop a plague. And he later bought the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, and the temple would be built there a generation later, the place where David acted as a king priest. And then when Solomon dedicated the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, he presides as a king priest, offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, just as David did in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And the peace offerings, they were communion offerings. The people communed. There's something very important there. Why? Because in the New Testament, when Jesus, the great eternal high priest, established the new and eternal covenant, he gave us the Eucharist, which has an element of communion. He tells us in John chapter 6, unless you eat the flesh and the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. He underlines the importance of this act of communion. And so finally, in 1 Kings 9:25, we see Solomon acting as a king priest. And you're probably thinking, why are you wasting so much time talking about this? And I'll tell you why. Because when you go to the letter to the Hebrews, especially chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10, it underlines that Jesus is priest, prophet, and king for all of eternity. So we see David and Solomon fulfilling ideal qualities of kingship in Jerusalem, recalling the model of Melchizedek. And it's all preparing us to understand the Christ, the Messiah who will come, who will be priest, prophet, and king for all of eternity. So Solomon built a fleet of ships and he stationed them on the shores of the Red Sea. And that's really important as well because some scholars, they say that the word for the Red Sea, Yam Suf, maybe it was just a little lake of water. And other scholars will point to this verse in First Kings and say, look, it must have been the large body of water known as the Red Sea because Solomon had a fleet of ships built there. So you often see Bible studies on the book of Genesis where they'll bring up this argument and they'll say that maybe it was just this lake of water, the Sea of Reeds, which is this lake of water that is over in Egypt, between Egypt and Israel. And so some think, well, maybe it's just that. But then others say, no, 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 no. Go to 1 Kings 9:28 and look at this. Solomon built a fleet of ships and he stationed them on Yam Suf, on the Red Sea. It must have been that large body of water, the Red Sea, that Israel crossed through in Exodus 14 when they came out of Egypt. And so there's some other beautiful things that to be said here. The Queen of Sheba, she's amazed at Solomon's wisdom. So she comes all the way from southern Arabia and she visits Solomon. It shows us something about the Queen of Sheba. She recognizes not only the wisdom of Solomon, but the work of the Lord in the life of Solomon. So look at this. Solomon says, "Blessed be the," oh, she says, I'm sorry, "Blessed be the Lord your God who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king that you may execute justice and righteousness." So she recognized the work of God that God was doing in Solomon. And so in the Gospels, when you get to the Gospels, Jesus will refer back to this and he'll say, there's someone greater than Solomon. In other words, we need to recognize who Christ is, the one who is greater than Solomon. And if the Queen of Sheba was blessed because she came to visit Solomon, and if she recognized the work that God did in his life, how much more should we recognize the Christ, the Messiah? So in 1 Kings 10:14, it says that Solomon was exceedingly rich. He received 666 talents of gold a year. So scholars will say that the weight of the talent would vary depending on the century. But it was generally speaking the amount of gold or silver that a soldier could carry. So you're looking at between 80 and 120 pounds for a talent. That's a lot of gold. But remember that the weight could vary. So you're going to get different guesstimates. But the bottom line is that Solomon was exceedingly rich. And not only that, the number 666 only comes up one more time in scripture. You find that in Revelation chapter 13, 18, when it talks about the figure known as the beast, whose number is 666. So many scholars will say that he's drawing from Solomon. The book of Revelation is drawing from Solomon, and it underlines, in essence, it implicitly underlines the great economic prestige and control that this figure will have, that's referred to in Revelation chapter 13, 18. So you can look at my videos on the book of Revelation if you want to study that more. Go to the playlist, look at the videos that I have on this channel in the book of Revelation, and I go into a lot more detail on that. But for our purposes here in 1 Kings 10:14, the narrator is underlining the great prestige. The kingship was never at a height like this before. There was really a power vacuum that happened in Egypt and also in the Assyrian Empire. And so the kingdom of Israel just explodes at this moment. It's got an incredible height of prestige and economic, you could say, prestige as well. And so Solomon is receiving all these gifts as well. Solomon builds an ivory throne and he covers it with gold. And you might be thinking, Father, why do you want to waste your time talking about this? Well, let me tell you why. The ivory throne would have reminded people of the temple. The temple was built with white limestone, and it was covered with gold. And Solomon's ivory throne is white and gold. So many scholars say that if you saw the temple from a distance, it would have just gleamed in the sunlight. It would have been incredible to see with the sun hitting it and the white and the gold just shining. And so Solomon builds a throne that reminds you of the temple. What's the theology behind this? Well, the theology behind it is that God, the Lord God, is enthroned in the temple. The God of Israel reigns in the midst of his people. And Solomon is like the viceroy. He's the one who acts in the place of the king. And so he's on a throne that reminds you of the temple, and it underlines his role as the one who acts on behalf of God, who rules with righteousness and justice. And so you can look at Psalm 72 if you want a good image of this. And so you can really see that he's at his height right now. The kingdom itself is at its height. So it says the king also made a great ivory throne and overlaid it with the finest gold. And the throne had 6 steps, and at the back of the throne was a calf's head. And on each side of the seat were armrests and 2 lions standing beside the armrest, while 12 lions stood there, one on each end of the step on the 6 steps. And the like of it was never made in any kingdom. So his throne was greater than any throne you'd ever seen. It was absolutely amazing. Maybe 12 lions because it represented the people of Israel. And if you go back to that great prophecy in Genesis 49, verses 9 through 10, the future king is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Of course, we understand that that's a prophecy of the coming of the Messiah, but maybe there's a little reference back to their lions, the tribe of Judah, the king from Judah, and his throne. And so possibly there's a little bit of reference back there. What's also really interesting is in Deuteronomy 17:14 to 20, it talks about how the king would be like a living model for the people. He would keep a copy of the Torah. He would read it. He would be one of many brethren. And it also says that he would not multiply gold or silver or horses or wives. And unfortunately, he's not going to keep this. So at the end of the chapter, we see something really incredible. Solomon has ships that sail all the way to Tarshish. Tarshish is where Gibraltar is. So his fleet is going to the farthest ends of the known world. They're bringing back gifts for the king. And what's really amazing is 1 Kings 10:23 to 24. Solomon is receiving gifts from everyone. It has the sense of like he's loved and blessed. He's giving great gifts to Bathsheba. He's receiving great gifts. And this is really beautiful because when you get to Matthew chapter 2, and you read that great messianic prophecy, you see how the Magi come from the east, and they bring Jesus, the new king, a descendant of Solomon. They bring him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So there's something beautiful about Solomon receiving all these gifts. Well, that's the height of his kingship. Now the story changes, and we're going to talk about his downfall. So, what was the downfall of Solomon? Solomon had many wives and concubines. It says that now Solomon loved many foreign women, the daughter of the Pharaoh, and Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonite, and Hittite women. Why was he loving these women? What's the deal here? Well, there might be a couple reasons behind this. But Solomon, during this time period, could have said, guys, this is all for the good of the kingdom. We're going to make peace with all these cultures around us. And that's why he had all these wives. This was something that you would do politically. You would marry other tribes, and then you would become peaceful with those tribes through intermarriage. But the big problem was is that through those intermarriages, the tribes would introduce their gods into Israel. So in verse 3, it says he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. The number is 1,000 altogether. There may be some intentional symbolism there because 1,000 represents something of a vast number that you can't count. He's got so many wives and concubines, you can't even count them. 700 wives and 300 concubines. But then it says, his wives turned away his heart. So here's the big problem: wisdom is now being turned away. Solomon is going to turn away from wisdom. And this is going to lead to the downfall of the kingdom of Israel. It's going to take hundreds of years for this to happen, but the very beginning is Solomon's marriage to foreign women. When you read the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, they are going to emphasize we must avoid marriages with foreign women because it will lead to idolatry, worship of false gods. So it says that for when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the god of the Sidonites, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. So east of Jerusalem could be the Mount of Olives. It could be also where Gehenna is, where Jesus refers to Gehenna, which is really kind of southeast. Most likely it's referring to the Mount of Olives. But these gods involved strange forms of sacrifice, and some of them involved or required child sacrifice. So the prophets are going to pick up on this, and they're going to talk about how terrible this was, that children were sacrificed to these false gods. And even to this day, when we talk about abortion, when we think about how terrible abortion is, it in a certain way reminds us of the horror of these sacrifices to these false gods. So you can see how terrible this was in the eyes of the Lord. So Solomon had 1,000 wives. There's a little bit of rhetoric here, but he only had one child who was a spoiled brat, and his name was Rehoboam. And Rehoboam is going to divide the kingdom. There is a non-biblical tradition among Ethiopian Jews that he also had a child through Bathsheba, and she went back to Ethiopia, and that's kind of where the Ethiopian Jews came from. But in the scriptures that we're reading, we only hear of one child. So this could be a non-biblical tradition that has some weight, okay, as well. But for the purpose of our story, It's going to focus on Rehoboam. Okay. So Solomon's sin causes division in the kingdom. Therefore, the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been on your mind and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you. Remember chapter 9, where we had this conditional thing. You have to follow this covenant. I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. So basically, Solomon, the kingdom will be united while you are king. But after you die, with that spoiled brat, Rehoboam, the kingdom is going to be divided. Sin causes division. It leads to division. It led to division of the people of Israel. You go all the way back to Genesis 3, and you will see the ways that sin caused division between Adam, between Eve, and between God, and even between creation, if you go back to Genesis 3. So, as noted earlier, the Lord tells Solomon that the kingdom will remain united during his lifetime, only on behalf of the promise made to David, the unconditional promise. But your kingdom is going to be divided, and eventually you're going to be taken out of the land. You're going to lose the blessings and the benefits attached to that promise because you're not living out the covenant. So, moreover, on behalf of the dynastic promise, in 2 Samuel 7, the kingdom will remain one, and one tribe will continue to remain together with a Davidic king, and that's going to be the tribe of Judah in Jerusalem. So then it goes into a little bit about Solomon's adversaries. Due to Solomon's sins, a number of his adversaries began to rise up against him. You had Hadad, the Edomite. You had Rezin, who eventually became king of Damascus. That's the neighbor in the north in Syria. And then you had Jeroboam, the Ephraimite, the servant of Solomon. Jeroboam is an interesting guy. I'm going to talk about him in a second. He's going to lead the rebellion, which is going to cause the northern kingdom to separate from the south. But before that happens, a very strange prophet by the name of Ahijah, who is a prophet, he tells Jeroboam, and he tears a garment in the presence of Jeroboam, Solomon's servant, and he gives Jeroboam 10 pieces of the garment. It's going to represent the 10 tribes in the north. Thus, Jeroboam is going to reign over the 10 tribes in the north, referred to as Israel. So, all of this is what's called a symbolic prophetic action. You're going to see many symbolic prophetic actions in the prophecies of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah, where they do an action and it's related to the prophecy. So, he's tearing up this garment into 12 pieces and he goes, Jeroboam, here's 10. This represents that you're going to be a king over 10 tribes. The kingdom will be torn apart like a garment. So, how's all this going to take place? So, Jeroboam, he's a really interesting guy. At one point, he was a loyal servant of Solomon, and later he fled to Egypt. So he's kind of like an anti-Moses figure. When Solomon became aware of, this is going to happen, and aware of this, that Jeroboam would eventually become a king over the northern kingdom, Jeroboam had to flee for his life. So I like to call him the anti-Moses figure. Rather than bringing Israel out of Egypt so that they could be united in the promised land, he comes out of Egypt and he causes the division of the kingdom. That's really interesting. So he comes out of Egypt to divide the kingdom. So that's why I call him the anti-Moses figure. That's my own term. So, you might not find that in many books, but you get the idea. He's coming out of Egypt just like Moses, but this is going to bring division. And so what is he going to do? When he sets up this kingdom, the king in the south, Rehoboam, he is not a man who seeks wisdom. He actually disrespects his father. Rehoboam's going to disrespect his father. I don't want to get into what he says because it's very profane, but he doesn't listen to the wisdom of the older men. He wants to tax the people. And so the northern kingdom is going to say, we can't take this. And so it's going to make it really easy for Jeroboam, the former servant, to lead